Welcome. In this video, we'll explore why FHIR Foundry matters to decision makers and subject matter experts, from understanding how SDOs set priorities to tackling real-world FHIR adoption challenges. We'll break it down from multiple stakeholder perspectives and show how the Foundry platform connects it all. Let's get started.
The primary resource for the production side is just foundry.hl7.org. That did release in May of 2024 at the Connectathon with a lot of general discussion, and it is in its limited production release state. It is primarily supporting the Da Vinci accelerator as well as the FAST accelerator, and the objective is to expand that to as many, if not all, the accelerator programs at HL7 as possible, and then beyond that as well. But we are going about it somewhat pragmatically and in an incremental fashion. I'll skip my own title slides here. The system itself, we're kind of proud to have some recognition. It won the AHRQ Most Innovative Category Award earlier this year for the CDS Connect Challenge. The kind of anecdote that I like to explain to people, and one of the core problems it's trying to solve is if you remember the early days of the browser wars, and particularly kind of in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was no real reference browser implementation, and it created a lot of problems because we'd all go from site to site and something wouldn't be working or look kind of weird on one specific browser, and it's like, oh, I'll try it in this browser, try it with the other one. You know, the web was still in kind of its earlier days of mass standardization. But there was a kind of a fundamental issue in that not having any sort of de facto gold standard for what a browser was meant that it largely became up to the market leaders to set the tone and timbre for how to interpret some of the gaps in the specifications itself. And so for most people, that ended up being Netscape Navigator, but those who use Internet Explorer had a lot of problems because there were just simply different implementations of that. And we kind of have the same type of issues within the HL7 FHIR community because initially, there weren't really reference implementations that went. I mean, there were some, but the primary artifacts of HL7 are mostly specifications and the standards themselves, which leaves a lot to be desired in the hands of implementers and FHIR adopters when they don't really understand the way something's supposed to work. So Foundry kind of flips that on its head a little bit as a very adoption-centric vehicle in combination with the specifications themselves, which is intended to make FHIR a much more adoptable, approachable, and lower barrier to entry set of standards to implement. So rather than going and having a deep technical conversation on what this does, this presentation really breaks down Foundry from the perspective of 5 different types of stakeholders or personas. The first of those is more of an executive business decision maker, or more of like a strategic thinker, someone who's in charge of organization-wide interoperability, maybe at a provider pair organization, IT, other strategic decision maker type role. The primary value proposition for Foundry is kind of twofold for this type of person. First of all, as an adopter of FHIR, Foundry will become the go-to hub for finding a curated set of reference implementations or RIs that are compliant with the FHIR specifications, and then through additional partnerships and integrations, also start to provide some objective measures of kind of how compliant some of those products within Foundry actually are in relation to the specifications. And then as a publisher of a piece of software, or as maybe some sort of CDS library, computable content that's oriented around FHIR, and this is more for like policymakers and maybe clinical specialty societies, Foundry will become more and more important to the dissemination of FHIR-based artifacts, especially under the curation and governance umbrella of HL7. And as more of the advanced automation features of Foundry start to come online, it'll become more clear that it's more of a kind of a supply chain vehicle as well to publish these artifacts, as well as start to distribute them in a runnable fashion to FHIR adopters. All right, so HL7, and not just HL7, but all standards developing organizations, tend to focus on some combination of the top three areas of focus. One being like semantic data interoperability, things like, the meaning of specific value sets, how they should be used, the exact nature of the data model, the way you extend that data model, such as FHIR profiles. Secondly, wire protocol compatibility, meaning the size and shape of the envelopes as they go across the internet, the specific way that security needs to work, or that the point-to-point negotiation of sending a payload between 2 points. And then lastly, DSLs, or domain-specific languages, meaning things like CQL, or clinical quality language, that are more akin to an actual programming language than they are a data representation standard. And the vast majority of the artifacts from HL7 and other SDOs, are all about the specifications, really. It's not about software. You can't actually ballot a piece of software at HL7 because that's not the point of the organization. The main gap to an implementer is in this infinitely large set of challenges between the specification as published by HL7 and actually implementing that in a production capacity within your local environment. And it could be compliance, the actual operation, gaps in the standard, the way things are versioned, taxation, liability, the applicability of development tools. There's so many issues that come into play between these 2 points. It becomes self-evident why there's such an implementation delay between the time something is published and 5-10 years later, or at the the national level, it can actually become kind of a usable standard in practice. So enter the HL7 implementation division to try to address these types of gap areas where it isn't necessarily HL7's focus to go into all of these gap areas. However, by creating best practices, doing a lot of education, like this webinar series is a good example of that, providing some level of community support, some administrative functions, such as for the FHIR accelerators, we can rapidly decrease the footprint of some of the gap areas to make it more attainable for organizations that don't have massive informatics teams to start addressing some of these more complex FHIR integration use cases. The FHIR Foundry itself it falls directly into HL7's kind of longer term plans for the organization as a whole. So from an executive standpoint, it is very much in line with HL7's mission, although the Foundry itself is not really about dissemination of specifications themselves. All right, so another way of looking at it, less from an organizational perspective, but from the process of publishing FHIR-based reference implementations, is that the publication process is somewhat akin to academic publishing in that it follows kind of a somewhat predictable write, publish, and try type methodology, where you write a specification, there's some degree of demoing. What's your thought? Okay, and this model is great, but what ends up happening is that once a specification is published, it kind of gets thrown over a proverbial wall. And in reality, the people that are developing these specifications, and especially those that are coming from industry, they have a specific timeline they're on. Their own interests are on a cycle. So there's, after balloting, and especially for reference implementation purposes, there's often a mass exodus of the original development effort towards kind of going on to the next thing, because that's just reality. Is you can't keep indefinitely investing time and money into specification once you've actually solved the core challenge. And the vacuum that creates after a lot of the effort has left the room, especially once it gets thrown over the wall worldwide, people start implementing it. When it creates implementation issues, we have a tendency to say, well, this is a vendor problem. You need to work within that space. You file a ticket within Jira. But a lot of times, the problems will be in those, on the previous slide, the areas that are not technically within the spec, and so we don't want to listen a lot of times, because even though it's preventing people from adopting what's otherwise great work. So what Foundry does is it acknowledges that, the way that the world works, but it tries to flip those publish and try steps a little bit. And so once a developer of an implementation guide for HL7 starts writing that and developing a reference implementations, we want them to take the software reference implementation and publish it to Foundry itself in a runnable fashion. Ideally, that HL7 can also host in a special environment. I'm going to talk about that in a few slides as well. So to run a single kind of public copy to provide a downloadable build that people can download onto their local computers, run in their local context, with their own data if they want to. And the RIs are open source software. And so while it may not be technically a gold standard, it's providing people some form of baseline upon which they can then customize that and adapt it to their local needs, as opposed to starting with only the specification itself. And so that feedback cycle, as it is in software engineering, is incredibly important to making the product, the specification itself, more robust and more reflective of real world concerns early on, such that by the time you get to publishing, you've already been through a number of feedback cycles with people outside of the authoring group of the specification itself. So this is a little bit of a change from what often happens today, being that people show up at a HL7 Connect-a-thon with a reference implementation at hand. They meet the checkbox for an implementation guide to go to ballot, and then they're just off to the races. But we want to start that actual feedback cycle much earlier. And for less technical stakeholders, meaning people that they don't want to necessarily be in the weeds of everything, but are still a stakeholder of an implementation guide. This also provides a vehicle to start seeing the way that the different moving parts involved in a use case can kind of click together. And I'll show that in action here if we have time. So to kind of sum up the executive, excuse me, and one last note on that. So, and then once an implementation of the guide does go to ballot, the idea is the reference implementation is not necessarily 100% complete, but complete enough to be that baseline of future implementation for every FHIR adopter out there. And by doing so, to also encourage community development to help address the vacuum that's left in the room once the initial developers, the RI, may have already gone on to other things. Yeah, again, all of those software projects that are being contributed as reference implementations are either an Apache 2.0 open source license or MIT, or another very similar maximally permissive license worldwide without any sort of encumbrance on it that would prevent you from doing that. Okay. So again, from executive perspective, Foundry provides immediately reusable software, and not a lot today, but this is the direction it's going. The entire catalog is actively curated by a small curation team, including myself, Diego Kaminker being the primary curative decision maker there, and a few other folks. We're also going to be expanding the curation team incrementally moving forward to make it more sustainable and less of a burden for the 4 people that are curators today. It's intended to lower the barrier of entry to FHIR adoption substantially and create community trust by engaging in the development of implementation guides earlier on through running software. Foundry itself provides some specific services to the accelerators. So, DaVinci and FAST have a component where Foundry provides developer support to be able to submit things, to run copies of their reference implementation, to provide support of the Connect-a-thons, to do the distributable type stuff. And so for people with CDEX, for example, that under the DaVinci program that want to distribute that and run that are able to do that and have somewhere to ping if they have an issue running it. All right, I'm gonna skip a few of these slides. Roadmap wise, it did launch in May 2024. The software distribution features are being incrementally added, and it takes a while to do that, in good part because reference implementations generally were not really designed to be distributed in a runnable form. They were done, or more often than not, they're done with kind of a least effort type mentality because they aren't intended to be production applications. That was not an expectation set upon reference implementation developers early on, but we want to make those more robust and useful. In the future, we're also going to be expanding to not just like FHIR services and FHIR clients to more like computable content as well, complex license types, meaning things that do not have such a clean open source license. Like terminology worldwide is very complex from a licensing standpoint, and we're working on ways to address that. Telemetry, I'm just going to skip on for the sake of time. Okay. So skipping on now to these kind of the second type of persona that uses Foundry, and that's more of a subject matter expert. So a SME being someone that is an expert in maybe a particular clinical domain or an area of practice. And they need to understand a specific use case, such as an implementation guide at a very detailed level, and especially the way that FHIR resources move across the wire and the behavior of the different parties. But they aren't really a developer. They just need to understand that the use case, ins and outs, the policies that affect it, maybe influence some changes in the specifications. A clinical informaticist would be more like in this specific category, because they're not necessarily developing the software itself, but need to work with the information and have to be aware of all the malleability issues that are involved in transforming it. So to get more into this perspective, we need to talk about a few core concepts that exist within Foundry that are a little bit new because they come from the software engineering space. The first is a product. When you look at Foundry itself, and when you just go, so this is just foundry.hl7.org, you'll see all these little tiles this in the master catalog here, and each one of these corresponds to what's called a product in Foundry. And all that really is, it's more of a marketing definition, typically of a piece of software or of a collection of software that go together. So as an RI developer, this is usually going to translate to one of these product listings per piece of software that you're running. More complex reference implementations will often have 2, 3, 4, some have half a dozen to close to a dozen pieces of moving software under that same umbrella. So it isn't a one-to-one relationship, but oftentimes it is. And sometimes there are product listings that actually will bundle all of the things together under one runnable package that users can download and run. So the product definition itself is really just the, more of a marketing, basic metadata, images, screenshots, but there's no versions of the product defined at that level. Now, within the product itself, or excuse me, so within the product itself, the actual builds of the piece of software of a given artifact are what's versioned. This is the technical asset that's actually runnable. You can have as many builds of a piece of software as you need to effectively disseminate it to potential users. And all of that will get containerized under the product itself. If you're familiar with the way containerization works, a build roughly corresponds to a Docker image or an OCI image in most cases. A bundle, we talked about that a little bit before. This is not a FHIR bundle, unfortunately. We're using the same term, but it's really just a collection of individual products under a single hierarchy. It's analogous to if you go to like a movie store or something and you buy a collection of 5 movies for one price. Like you're buying one thing, but you're actually getting an entire suite of capabilities or content under that one license, which is open source. And then the platform environment itself. So Foundry has an abstract definition of an actual runtime environment. And for most people, this is going to be your local computer, but in the future, it is also going to expand to direct integration with your own cloud environment. So if you run your own Amazon Web Services account in a sandbox type mode where we could be able to integrate and deploy things for you, we're also going to be helping deploy RIs into your environment of choice. And we're doing that in as vendor neutral of a way as possible, leveraging containerization and standards to the maximum extent that we can. As a subject matter expert, though, if you really are just interested in understanding the use case, we'd encourage you to go to the Foundry and specific DaVinci's primary use case, look up the particular implementation guide or the reference implementation, and then we're treating the individual product listings as kind of an amalgamation of all the various links, be it to the IGs themselves, Confluence pages, project management, if there's academic literature that's associated, with it, especially the source code and feedback links. If you have a question about that specific RI, you can do that all within the site here. And again, the idea too is that the entire catalog being curated. And so we always want every product listing to be up to date and not some 5-year-old long abandoned piece of software that no one really understands. So there is a life cycle that's associated with every product listing, unlike just a wiki page where it can just sit there indefinitely and may or may not be accurate. Here's another listing, more directly under the HL7 umbrella for DaVinci CDEX. Every listing will have instructions that come with it. And so if you are attempting to run it yourself, oftentimes this is going to have local instructions. For other more cloud demoable products, you'll see a tutorial on how to actually, if I were able to scroll down in these slides, you would see like pages of how-to instructions for CDEX and how to use the cloud environment to actually run it in that shared public environment. Under bundled products here, you'll see some of the, and again, this would scroll down on the website, but you'll see that CDEX actually comes with 2 copies of FHIR, and FHIR is a third-party piece of software that the CDEX developers did not write. And so what Foundry is doing here is it's taking care of the fact that Happy has its own set of maintainers and its own product listing, and it could be maintained by a completely different curation team, but we still need to bundle this in with CDEX as a dependency in order to write it. And then in the future, we're also, because, I saw a question just coming in too. Not every RI should only be able to be run on a single FHIR backend or with a single set of data. So we're also going to be, we're doing integrations with other FHIR servers as well. And so when we start to add those into Foundry, you'll have the ability to test an RI against different combinations of backends to give you a greater sense of understanding on what it may be specific or may have problems with a specific vendor stack, and then couple that with the other test feedback from our testing partners, such as Aegis, that can provide metrics on how compliant a specific combination is.
Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, give us a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next one.